What if history is not incomplete because evidence is missing, but because what survived should never have existed in the first place? How does a human heart remain beside a body for more than 3 centuries without decay? How can hair and part of an ear survive nearly 2,000 years beneath volcanic ash? And why were entire human bodies deliberately preserved 7,000 years ago, long before the civilizations we credit with inventing mummification? A noblewoman buried with her husband's heart in France, a Pompeii skeleton that refused to fully decompose, an ancient coastal culture that preserved every dead, regardless of age or status. If these discoveries are real, and they are, then the real mystery is not what archaeology has found, but what our understanding of history has quietly failed to explain. For generations, archaeology has been built on a quiet assumption that the past unfolds in a gradual, understandable progression. Technologies improve slowly, beliefs evolve step by step. Cultural practices follow patterns we can trace, explain, and categorize. Yet every so often, discoveries emerge that refuse to fit that framework. Bodies preserved far beyond what soil chemistry should allow. Burial practices appearing thousands of years before they were supposedly invented. Human remains that blur the boundary between what we define as ancient and what feels disturbingly modern. These are not isolated curiosities. They are well-documented finds, excavated, measured, analyzed by laboratories and institutions that rely on caution rather than speculation, and still they raise questions that modern science can only approach, not resolve. Why would a 17th-century noblewoman be buried holding her husband's heart, and why would her body remain intact when hundreds of others around her did not? How could soft tissue survive beneath the ashes of a volcanic catastrophe meant to erase life instantly? Why did a prehistoric coastal society preserve every member of their community, centuries before mummification was believed to exist? Archaeology is often portrayed as a discipline of answers. In reality, it is a discipline of constraints, limited by what survives, what erodes, and what chance allows us to uncover. Every artifact is a fragment. Every skeleton is an incomplete sentence written by time. The 10 discoveries explored in this journey do not claim to rewrite history. They do something far more unsettling. They expose gaps, moments where established explanations grow thin and certainty gives way to probability. Some scientists point to rare environmental conditions. Others propose cultural practices still poorly understood. In several cases, competing hypotheses coexist without resolution. And that is precisely where the true mystery lies. Because when evidence survives where it should not, and practices appear long before they are expected, history stops behaving like a finished record and begins to resemble an open investigation. With that in mind, we begin with a discovery that blends science, ritual, and human emotion in a way few archaeological finds ever have. 1. The noblewoman who was buried with her husband's heart. The story begins beneath the stone floors of a former convent in northwestern France, in the historic city of Rennes. What initially appeared to be a routine archaeological survey quickly transformed into one of the most emotionally unsettling discoveries of early modern Europe. Inside a sealed lead coffin lay the remarkably preserved body of a noblewoman from the 17th century. Her name, identified through archival records, was Louise de Quengo. She had lived more than 60 years, an impressive age for her time, but it was not her longevity that shocked researchers. It was what rested beside her. Placed carefully next to her body was a small lead container holding the embalmed heart of her husband, removed after his death and preserved for burial alongside her. The body itself defied expectation. After more than 350 years underground, Louise's skin, hair, internal organs, and even portions of her brain remained intact. Her face had collapsed slightly with time, but the form of the body was unmistakably human, intimate, and disturbingly present. Around her chest lay a simple wooden cross. Her clothing resembled that of a nun rather than a courtly noblewoman. This level of preservation was highly unusual, especially when compared to the surrounding graves. In the same burial ground, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of skeletons from the same century. Nearly all had decomposed entirely, reduced to bone alone. Why had this body survived? Researchers pointed first to the coffin. Lead, airtight and antimicrobial, creates an environment hostile to bacteria. But that explanation alone did not account for the stark contrast between Louise and the others buried nearby. Soil conditions were similar. Time was the same. And yet, one body endured while hundreds vanished. The heart offered a different kind of clue. In 17th century France, removing and preserving a heart was a practice reserved for elites, an act combining religious devotion, emotional attachment, and social status. Hearts were sometimes buried in separate locations, entrusted to churches or family crypts, believed to symbolize spiritual union beyond death. In Louise's case, the heart was not separated, it was returned. Some historians believe that after her husband's death, she withdrew from noble life and entered the convent, devoting her remaining years to faith. If so, her burial was not merely an act of mourning, but a carefully constructed ritual, binding love, piety, and memory into a single physical space. Yet questions remain. Why did this ritual coincide with such extraordinary preservation? Was it intention or coincidence? And how many similar stories were erased by time, leaving no body behind to challenge our assumptions? As archaeologists documented the final measurements, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not just a preserved corpse, it was a message, delivered across centuries, about how the living once tried to defeat forgetting itself. 2. The Pompeii skeleton that refused to fully decompose. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius lies the ancient city of Pompeii, a place synonymous with sudden death and total destruction. Buried beneath volcanic ash in 79 AD, Pompeii is often described as a frozen moment in time. Yet one discovery suggests that even catastrophe does not always erase the human body as completely as expected. During recent excavations, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton unlike most others found at the site. The bones belonged to a man named Marcus Venerius Secundio, a former slave who had risen to prominence within Pompeian society. His name appeared not only on his tomb inscription, but also in administrative records, confirming his real historical presence. What stunned researchers was not his identity, but his condition. After nearly 2,000 years, fragments of silver-white hair remained attached to his skull. Even more unsettling, portions of his ear tissue were still visible. In an environment known for heat, ash, and complete biological destruction, such preservation should have been impossible. Pompeii's victims typically tell a familiar story. Extreme temperatures, toxic gases, and collapsing structures killed instantly. Bodies either decomposed entirely or left hollow cavities later filled with plaster casts. Soft tissue survival was never part of that narrative. So why did Marcus endure differently? The answer may lie in his tomb. Unlike many Pompeii victims who died in the streets or homes, Marcus had been deliberately buried in a sealed chamber. The space was enclosed, limiting airflow and slowing microbial activity. This controlled environment may have created conditions favorable to partial preservation. But that explanation only goes so far. Some experts have proposed a more controversial hypothesis, that Marcus may have been intentionally embalmed. Mummification was not a standard Roman practice, reserved neither for commoners nor elites. And yet, fragments of textile discovered near the remains are now under analysis to determine whether they show signs of chemical treatment or deliberate preservation techniques. If proven true, the implications would be profound. Marcus had once been enslaved. After gaining freedom, he organized theatrical performances in Greek, a language associated with culture and prestige. His burial alone, full body rather than cremation, already marked him as exceptional. Preservation, intentional or not, would suggest experimentation at the margins of Roman funerary tradition. Still, certainty remains elusive. Was this an accidental convergence of architecture and climate, or evidence of a forgotten funerary practice rarely recorded in texts? Beneath layers of ash meant to end all stories, Marcus Venerius Secundio left one unfinished, written not in words but in hair that time could not fully erase. 3. the gold-covered mummy couple of ancient Egypt. On the northern edge of Egypt's Nile Delta lies the ancient city of Taposiris Magna, a site long associated with ritual, power, and religious authority. It was here that archaeologists uncovered one of the most visually arresting burial discoveries of the ancient world. Two mummies, a man and a woman, resting side by side for nearly 2,000 years. At first glance, the burial spoke of wealth. Both bodies had been carefully embalmed and partially covered in gold leaf, a material reserved for individuals believed to possess divine favor or elevated spiritual status. Gold, in ancient Egyptian belief, was not merely decorative, it symbolized eternity, incorruptibility, and the flesh of the gods themselves. Yet the tomb told a more complicated story. Unlike the sealed royal chambers of earlier dynasties, this burial had been partially compromised over time. Water seeped into the structure, accelerating decay and damaging much of the organic material. And still, enough survived to suggest deliberate, costly preparation rather than ordinary interment. Scattered around the mummies were hundreds of coins bearing the image of Cleopatra VII, anchoring the burial firmly within the late Ptolemaic period. On fragments of gold leaf, the unmistakable image of a scarab beetle remained visible, a symbol of rebirth, regeneration, and the eternal cycle of life and death. These details led researchers to a careful conclusion. The pair were unlikely to be royalty. Instead, they were probably high-ranking priests or religious officials, figures who acted as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Their proximity in death suggests a bond that extended beyond ritual duty, though whether that bond was marital, symbolic, or spiritual remains unknown. The question then is not whether they were important, but why they were buried together. In ancient Egyptian tradition, burial arrangements were rarely accidental. Placement conveyed meaning. Proximity implied connection. To rest side by side beneath gold was to declare a shared identity meant to persist beyond death itself. And yet, despite centuries of study, no inscription explains who they were. No text records their names. Their story survives only through materials that resisted decay. Gold, stone, symbols. Were they partners in life, bound again in death? Or was this pairing an expression of ritual hierarchy rather than affection? As archaeologists documented the chamber, one truth became clear. This was not simply a luxurious burial. It was a deliberate message about power, belief, and continuity, written in materials meant to outlast time. And if two lives could be joined so carefully in death, what other relationships lie hidden beneath the sands, their meaning still undeciphered? 4. The 7,000-year-old Chinchorro mummies that predate Egypt. Along the arid Pacific coast of northern Chile, where the desert meets the sea, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a funerary tradition so ancient that it reshapes the timeline of human ritual. Long before the pyramids of Egypt were conceived, the people of the Chinchorro culture were already preserving their dead. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest Chinchorro mummies at nearly 7,000 years old, thousands of years earlier than the earliest known Egyptian examples. But age alone is not what makes this discovery extraordinary. It is intent. Unlike later civilizations, the Chinchorro did not reserve mummification for elites, priests, or rulers. They preserved everyone: men and women, children, infants, even unborn fetuses. Death in their society was not filtered by status. It was communal. The mummification process itself was complex and deliberate. Bodies were carefully disassembled. Organs were removed. Skeletons were reinforced with sticks. Skin was treated, reshaped, and sometimes replaced. Faces were reconstructed with clay, and wigs made of human hair were applied. In some cases, the mummies were painted black, red, or ochre, each color corresponding to different phases of the tradition. Such labor-intensive practices raise an unsettling question. Why would a small coastal society invest so much effort into preserving the dead? One explanation points to environment. The extreme dryness of the Atacama Desert created conditions favorable to natural preservation, possibly inspiring early experimentation. But that does not explain the emotional commitment embedded in the process. These mummies were not hidden away. Many were kept within living spaces, remaining part of daily life long after death. To the Chinchorro, the dead were not gone. They were present. Archaeologists believe mummification served as a way to maintain social continuity in a harsh landscape where mortality, especially infant mortality, was high. Preserving the body may have helped preserve memory, identity, and communal stability in a world where loss was frequent. And yet, despite decades of study, no written language exists to explain their beliefs. What survives are bodies, silent, patient, and meticulously altered by human hands thousands of years ago. If complex mortuary rituals existed so early, what does that say about the emotional and spiritual depth of prehistoric societies? And how many similar traditions vanished without leaving a trace strong enough to endure? The Chinchorro mummies do not merely predate Egypt. They challenge the assumption that sophisticated belief systems required large civilizations to emerge. Sometimes the earliest answers come from the smallest communities, standing quietly at the edge of the sea. 5. The 2-million-year-old skull that redefined human origins. In a remote limestone cave system in South Africa known as Malapa Cave, a discovery emerged that forced scientists to confront one of the most fundamental questions in archaeology: where exactly do humans begin? The remains belong to a previously unknown hominin species dating back nearly 2 million years. What made the find extraordinary was not just its age, but its condition. Unlike most early hominin fossils, often fragmented and isolated, these skeletons were unusually complete, allowing researchers to examine the skull, pelvis, hands, feet, and limbs in rare detail. The anatomy told a contradictory story. The skull revealed a small brain, closer in size to that of ancient apes. The arms were long, suggesting climbing ability. Yet the pelvis, legs, and feet showed adaptations for upright walking strikingly similar to modern humans. The hands, capable of both grasping branches and manipulating objects, hinted at dexterity far beyond what had been assumed for that period. This mosaic of traits placed the species in an uncomfortable position within the evolutionary tree. It was neither fully ape nor fully human. Instead, it occupied an in-between state that challenged long-standing models of linear evolution. The circumstances of discovery added another layer of intrigue. One of the key fossils, a partial skeleton of a juvenile, was first noticed by a child during a field expedition. Further excavation revealed the remains of an adult female nearby. Both individuals appeared to have fallen into a natural vertical shaft, a geological trap that also contained fossils of numerous animal species. This accidental burial may be precisely why the remains survived. Preserved together, sealed from scavengers and environmental damage, the skeletons provided a snapshot of anatomy at a critical moment in evolutionary history. Some researchers argue that the advanced features of the pelvis and hands suggest a direct ancestral relationship to the genus Homo. Others caution that the species may represent a side branch, remarkable, but not our direct predecessor. The debate remains unresolved. But what is certain is this: the discovery blurred the boundary between human and not yet human. It revealed that evolution did not proceed in clean steps, but through overlapping experiments, some leading forward, others ending quietly. When standing before these fossils, archaeologists are not just studying bones. They are confronting a version of ourselves that almost was, and perhaps in some ways still is. If our origins are this complex, how many evolutionary paths have already vanished without leaving a trace strong enough to be found? 6. The 550-million-year-old fossils that marked the dawn of animal life. On the remote coastline of Newfoundland, Canada, within the windswept cliffs of Mistaken Point Ecological Reserve, archaeologists and paleontologists uncovered something that does not belong to human history at all, yet may be the most important discovery in this entire sequence. Pressed into ancient seabed rock are the faint impressions of life that existed more than 550 million years ago. These are not bones. They are not shells. They are the preserved outlines of soft-bodied organisms known as rangomorphs, creatures that lived long before dinosaurs, forests, or even complex ecosystems. Their shapes resemble fern fronds or branching feathers, spreading outward in repeating fractal-like patterns. Individually, the fossil traces are small, some only a few millimeters across, but reconstruction suggests that, when fully grown, some of these organisms reached lengths of nearly 2 meters. What makes their preservation extraordinary is their fragility. Soft-bodied organisms almost never fossilize. Without hard parts, they typically decay without leaving a trace. And yet here, dozens of specimens appear frozen in time, their delicate forms captured with astonishing clarity. The explanation lies in catastrophe. Scientists believe these organisms lived on the ocean floor during the Ediacaran period, a time when life was experimenting with complexity for the first time. A sudden underwater volcanic eruption released fine ash that rapidly buried the seabed. This ash acted like a natural mold, sealing the organisms in place before decomposition could occur. The result is one of the oldest known records of complex multicellular life on Earth. These fossils challenge long-held assumptions about the pace of evolution. They suggest that sophisticated body structures emerged far earlier than once believed, and then vanished, leaving no direct descendants. Rangomorphs appear to represent an evolutionary experiment that succeeded briefly, then disappeared entirely. No modern animals share their exact structure. This raises a disturbing possibility. What if the history of life is not a straight ascent toward complexity, but a landscape of lost branches, entire biological worlds that flourished, failed, and left only faint shadows behind? When researchers examine these impressions, they are not simply studying ancient organisms. They are looking at a moment when life itself was uncertain of what it might become. Before predators, before skeletons, before eyes. If such complex life existed and vanished without legacy, how many other beginnings were erased before they could shape the world we know? And if life itself can disappear so completely, what does that imply about the permanence of our own place in history? 7. The 2,000-year-old treasure hidden beneath Italy's hot springs. Beneath a quiet hilltop town in central Italy, steam still rises from ancient thermal waters once believed to possess divine healing power. At a site known today as San Casciano dei Bagni, archaeologists uncovered a hidden world that had remained sealed for more than 2,000 years. Buried nearly 5 meters underground, beneath layers of mud and mineral-rich sediment, lay an extraordinary collection of offerings. Thousands of bronze coins, gold rings, gemstone jewelry, ceremonial objects, and statues, many preserved in near-perfect condition. Unlike typical buried hoards, this treasure was not concealed in haste or hidden for later retrieval. It was deliberately given away. In antiquity, these hot springs were considered sacred. Both the Etruscans and later the Romans believed the waters were guarded by divine forces capable of curing illness and granting protection. Visitors came not merely to bathe, but to pray. They cast offerings into the pools, objects of value meant to secure favor from unseen powers. Among the discoveries, one object stood apart. A bronze statue of a serpent deity, nearly a meter in length, emerged intact from the sediment. Its form was unmistakable, a protective, coiled figure associated with health, renewal, and guardianship. Scholars believe it represents Agathos Daimon, a benevolent serpent spirit revered in Greco-Roman religious tradition. What makes this statue exceptional is not just its symbolism, but its scale. It is the largest known representation of such a serpent deity ever found, far surpassing similar examples displayed in major museums across Europe. The water itself played a crucial role in preservation. Warm, oxygen-poor, mineral-rich conditions slowed corrosion and shielded the offerings from decay. What had once been a place of prayer became unintentionally a vault. Archaeologists now believe the site functioned as a major spiritual and medical center for centuries. The sheer volume and diversity of offerings suggest repeated acts of devotion across generations, not a single ceremonial event. But questions remain. Why were some objects intentionally broken before being offered? Why did worship continue here even as empires rose and fell around it? And why did this sacred center disappear so completely from memory? As the artifacts are lifted from the mud and cleaned for study, they reveal a civilization that believed healing was not only physical, but negotiated through faith. And if an entire spiritual economy could vanish beneath a quiet town, how many other sacred centers still lie hidden, waiting beneath landscapes we no longer question? 8. The Amazon warrior woman with an arrow in her bone. For centuries, the Amazons were dismissed as myth, figures of legend said to exist only in the imaginations of ancient Greek storytellers. Fierce women who rode horses, wielded bows, and fought alongside men were considered symbolic, not historical. That assumption began to fracture with a discovery in the highlands of Armenia. At an ancient burial ground dating to roughly 2,800 years ago, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a woman interred with objects typically reserved for warriors. At first glance, the grave appeared to belong to someone of elevated status, but the skeleton told a far more confrontational story. The bones were unusually robust. Muscle attachment points along the shoulders and arms indicated long-term repetitive strain consistent with archery. The structure of the hips and legs suggested extensive horseback riding, an essential skill for steppe and mountain warfare. Then came the injury. Embedded deep within her left knee bone was the iron head of an arrow. Additional trauma marks were found on other parts of the skeleton, indicating multiple wounds sustained during violent encounters. These were not ceremonial injuries, they were the result of real combat. This was not a symbolic warrior. She had fought and likely died as one. Further analysis revealed that this woman was not an anomaly. Nearby graves belonging to both males and females displayed similar skeletal adaptations. Together, they suggested a society in which women actively participated in warfare rather than remaining confined to domestic roles. Such findings align uncomfortably well with ancient descriptions of the Amazons. Women said to live on the fringes of the known world, skilled in riding and combat, equal to men on the battlefield. For generations, historians dismissed these accounts as exaggerations or cultural metaphors. But bones do not exaggerate. The arrowhead embedded in her body offers a form of testimony no written source can easily dismiss. It confirms that women not only trained for war, but faced its consequences directly. The implications reach far beyond a single grave. If women fought and died as warriors in ancient Eurasia, how many other societies have been misrepresented or erased by assumptions shaped thousands of years later? Legends, it seems, may not be inventions after all. They may be distorted memories of realities we were never prepared to accept. And if this much truth survived in bone, what else has history buried beneath the comfort of myth? 9. The 5 Bronze Age axes buried deep in a Polish forest. In a remote woodland of northern Poland, far from known settlements or ancient roads, a faint signal from a metal detector revealed a mystery that has yet to find an answer. Beneath the forest floor of the Kościewy region, archaeologists uncovered 5 bronze axes dating back approximately 3,500 years, carefully placed, undisturbed, and deliberately hidden. At first glance, the objects appeared utilitarian. Axes were essential tools during the Bronze Age, used for chopping wood, shaping structures, and fighting. But closer examination told a different story. These were not ordinary axes. They belonged to a rare type known for slender necks and crescent-shaped blades, objects that balanced functionality with symbolic presence. Their condition was astonishing. Despite millennia underground in cold, acidic soil, their forms remained crisp, edges intact, surfaces only lightly corroded. What made the discovery truly unsettling was location. There were no signs of habitation nearby, no dwellings, no graves, no fortifications, no evidence that people had ever lived or even traveled regularly through this part of the forest. And yet, 5 valuable bronze objects had been transported here and buried together. Why? One hypothesis suggests ritual deposition. Across prehistoric Europe, weapons and tools were sometimes offered to gods associated with nature, warfare, or fertility. Forests, rivers, and wetlands were considered liminal spaces, thresholds between the human world and the divine. To bury an axe here may have been an act of sacrifice rather than storage. Another possibility points to conflict. The axes could represent war spoils, hidden hastily and never recovered. But this explanation falters when confronted with their careful placement. They were not scattered or damaged. They were arranged. Nearby, archaeologists also found a small bone pin dating to a different era entirely, suggesting the forest may have held long-term significance, reused and reinterpreted by successive cultures. Yet no definitive conclusion has emerged. Were these axes gifts to unseen forces, symbols of power deliberately removed from circulation, or messages left for reasons no longer legible to us? The Bronze Age left few written records. Meaning was embedded in action, not text, and when action is all that survives, interpretation becomes fragile. As researchers continue to analyze soil layers and metal composition, the forest remains silent. It offers no explanation, only proof that someone, long ago, believed this place mattered enough to bury something valuable and walk away forever. And if meaning can vanish so completely, how many rituals have dissolved into nothing more than objects without context? 10. The medieval castle buried beneath a basketball court. In the English city of Gloucester, a place defined today by traffic, concrete, and routine urban life, archaeologists uncovered a reminder that history does not always disappear. It is often repurposed, paved over, and forgotten. The discovery occurred beneath what appeared to be an unremarkable basketball court. During preparatory work, excavators began to encounter stone foundations and linear trenches that did not belong to any modern structure. Further investigation revealed the long-lost remains of Gloucester Castle, a fortified complex dating back nearly 1,000 years. Built shortly after the Norman conquest of the 11th century, the castle once stood as a symbol of royal authority. It functioned not only as a military stronghold, but as a political center, housing nobles, enforcing control, and shaping the city's medieval identity. For centuries, it dominated the surrounding landscape. And then it vanished. Historical records show that from the 15th to the 17th century, the castle fell into decline. Its stones were dismantled and reused to construct roads, houses, and civic buildings. What remained above ground was converted into a prison. By the late 18th century, even that was demolished. The land was flattened, repurposed, and eventually absorbed into the modern city. Until now. Beneath shallow layers of soil, archaeologists identified sections of defensive walls, stone-lined ditches, and raised causeways, features once designed to control access and repel attack. These remnants survived not because they were protected, but because they were forgotten. What makes the discovery unsettling is not the castle itself, but its proximity to everyday life. For decades, people walked, played, and gathered above medieval fortifications without realizing it. History was not hidden in a remote ruin, it was directly beneath their feet. This challenges a comforting assumption that the past exists somewhere else, safely contained in museums or distant landscapes. In reality, cities are layered constructions. Each generation builds atop the last, often without knowing what it erases. The basketball court was never meant to conceal a castle. It simply replaced it. And that raises a final question. If a royal fortress can disappear so completely beneath ordinary life, how many other chapters of history lie beneath our streets, our homes, and our routines, waiting not to be discovered, but merely noticed? When history refuses to stay finished. 10 discoveries. 10 moments where the past refuses to behave the way we expect it to. A body preserved with a human heart resting beside it. Hair surviving beneath volcanic ash meant to erase all life. Mummification practiced thousands of years before it was supposed to exist. Women fighting, bleeding, and dying on ancient battlefields. Castles buried not by disaster, but by everyday life. None of these findings alone is enough to overturn everything we know about history. There is no single artifact here that proves lost super civilizations, impossible technologies, or forgotten sciences beyond human reach. That is not the point. What these discoveries reveal is something more restrained and more unsettling. History is not a complete record. It is a reconstruction assembled from fragments that survived erosion, collapse, neglect, and chance. What we call the past is shaped not only by what remains, but by what did not endure. In several cases, science offers plausible explanations. Rare burial conditions can slow decay. Environmental chemistry can preserve the improbable. Social practices can be misunderstood when stripped of context. In other cases, the evidence is simply incomplete. Dating ranges overlap. Sites are reused. Objects lose their original meaning as cultures vanish. And when context is lost, certainty becomes impossible. This does not weaken science, it defines it. Archaeology advances not by clinging to comforting narratives, but by confronting anomalies honestly and demanding better evidence. The danger lies not in asking difficult questions, but in answering them too quickly. Because every discovery in this journey carries the same quiet warning: if knowledge is not preserved, transmitted, and understood, it can disappear, even at its peak. And one day, future archaeologists may look at our remains with the same confusion we feel today. Not because we lacked intelligence, but because too much was lost. History is not wrong, it is simply unfinished.